Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story this evening is the situation in Afghanistan. Pakistan's Army Chief General Qamar Bajwa was in Kabul on a day-long visit where he met with the Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani and Chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation of Afghanistan, Dr. Abdullah Abdullah. Interestingly, also present in the meeting was British Chief of Defence Staff, General Nicholas Patrick Carter. According to some reports, Britain has lately been facilitating Pak-Afghan meetings. It had in March facilitated a meeting of Pakistani and Afghan military and intelligence chiefs in Bahrain. Meanwhile, United States has urged the Taliban and the Afghan government to engage seriously in the ongoing peace process to prevent Islamic State militants from further aggravating an already tense situation in Afghanistan. Speaking about the latest atrocity in Kabul's Dasht-e-Barchi area, U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price told reporters in Washington on Monday, and I quote from what he said, "We're still looking into who is responsible, but I would note that ISIS has been responsible for similar attacks on Shia communities in Kabul in the past. Taliban have rejected claims by the Kabul government that they are responsible for the attack." Last Sunday, a roadside bomb struck a bus in the southeastern province of Zabul, killing 11 passengers and leaving 25 injured. A day before, a Taliban attack had killed 5 policemen. Another attack on Friday in the same province killed 10 soldiers when they were ambushed. Violence has been sharply rising in Afghanistan since the U.S. began withdrawing its troops. To discuss the situation further, I'm joined by Rahimullah, resident editor of the news in Peshawar, and Dr. Victoria Fontan, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and Vice President of Academic Affairs at the American University of Afghanistan. Thank you to the both panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Fontan here. Dr. Fontan, as I said, violence is sharply increasing, even by the standards of Afghanistan. And the Dasht-e-Barchi attack in particular, and this reminds us in Pakistan of the horrific attack on the Army Public School, because this attack has claimed the innocent lives of a number of girl students. But here's the issue. So while Kabul is trying to reach out to the Taliban, it also simultaneously, every time there is an attack, it holds the Taliban responsible even before investigations have begun, while the Taliban have continuously denied such attacks, saying that we only attack security forces. So you give me a sense of how you look at it and what the impression on the street is.
I can't really speak for Afghans, but I can relay some of what I'm hearing. And the word on the street is that interlocutors, both the Afghan government and the Taliban, are holding each other responsible for those attacks, while they both have a piece to the puzzle of security and maintaining security in Afghanistan. And so it's quite a cynical discussion and blaming game that is happening back and forth between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And what we know for sure is that the borders of the Taliban group are quite porous. And so there is not one Taliban entity. There are various groups out there. And sometimes some commanders unhappy with some policies are going to go out and do their own thing and then maybe join another group. And so it's not that we are looking at one group that is a single monolith that can control its own borders. And I think that those attacks are the illustration of the fact that neither the Afghan government nor the Taliban can actually maintain the security of Afghanistan at this time. And so that's why those negotiations, those high-level negotiations, are so important, because whilst both entities have the capability to do that, maybe they do not have the will, and that has to change for the sake of Afghanistan, but also, as you mentioned, the neighboring countries, because a weak Afghanistan and a conflict-ridden Afghanistan will have dreadful consequences on Pakistan as well, and that has been seen, unfortunately, in the past.
Right. I'm going to get to that because, as I said, the Pakistan Army chief was there, and one of the things that he talked about, not just in yesterday's visit, but also previously also, is that Afghanistan and Pakistan security are interlinked. But let me take you back to what you said about different groups. Now, if I have heard you correctly, you're talking about Taliban. If there are Taliban groups that can act independently, then it is hard to believe that the Taliban can actually declare a ceasefire and then not a bullet is shot during the 3 days. And of course, they've announced a ceasefire for upcoming Eid, but we have seen previously there have been Eid ceasefires. And when a ceasefire is declared, then it is all calm and quiet. Of course, we're not talking about ISIS and certain other freelancers, but we're talking about the Taliban. So it's difficult to believe that there are Taliban groups that might be doing something that the top leadership is not aware of.
It's very easy for one unhappy camper to actually take on to another group to carry out an attack through a different banner. And we've seen that in the previous Kabul University attack. We've seen that in other attacks in Afghanistan. So I would say that, whilst the Eid ceasefire is likely to succeed, it is also an extremely cynical ceasefire because somehow the Taliban have seen that the reactions to the girls' school bombing have been so let's say outraged on the part of the Afghan civil society and from the Afghan population in general. They've seen that outrage and they're starting to realize that maybe they are also losing this popular support. So that's why this ceasefire has been called upon. And even though it is difficult for them to control what is happening in all parts of the country in terms of kinetic insurgent activity, this Eid ceasefire is important because it is bringing the illusion back of them having control over those different groups. So in that sense, it is probably going to work, but I do not believe for 1 second that they can actually control what is happening with regards to upsurge of violence in Afghanistan in different parts of the country and also in Kabul.
Okay, let me pull in Rahimullah Yusufzai at this point. So, Mr. Yusufzai, Dr. Fontan is making a point which is interesting and I would say at one level is perhaps also contradictory. One is that, there are cadres that sort of move from under one banner to another banner. And also the fact that she's saying that they have declared a ceasefire because they did not anticipate the kind of anger that the school attack would cause, which is difficult to believe because obviously if you end up killing so many girl students, it's an outrage and it will definitely cause a lot of anger. The Taliban, as I said in my opening, have already said that they're not responsible for this. In fact, they've rejected claims by the Kabul government. We also know that every time there is an attack in Kabul, the Ghani government, especially Amrullah Saleh, immediately comes on record and talks about the Taliban. So give me your sense of how you look at this, because there have been previous attacks in Kabul and in Jalalabad, which ultimately were traced back to Daesh. What do you think about this particular attack?
This attack in Daste-Barchi in the Hazara community populated area was so outrageous that even the ISIS, Daesh, did not claim responsibility. Although usually they all very quickly and proudly claim responsibility for these kind of attacks, especially targeting the Shias. Taliban, were already going to announce the ceasefire. They do it every year now, 3-day ceasefire. It's not because of this attack in Kabul that they were, forced to announce a ceasefire. The only question is whether they do it publicly or they do it privately. In the past, there used to be a ceasefire without being announced. But for the last few years, Taliban are doing it publicly and they say that we will observe a ceasefire to enable the Afghan people to celebrate Eid peacefully. Now, the Americans also, the U.S. government was, suspicious, the Afghan government also, that Taliban leadership does not control all their commanders and fighters. That's why, if you remember, last year when the peace agreement was being signed in Doha on 29th of February between the US and Taliban, the Americans put up a condition that Taliban would observe a ceasefire for 1 week. They would show their intention for peace, number one. Secondly, that they do control all their fighters. Taliban accepted that challenge. They ensured that the ceasefire for 1 week, not for 3 days, held. There were no attacks. The US was satisfied. And then they signed the peace agreement on 29th of February. So I think that, yes, there have been groupings in the past. One splinter group was led by Mullah Muhammad Rasul, who is now in Pakistani custody, and that group has almost vanished. Only one commander is now in that group, and he has joined the Afghan government, Mullah Abdul Manan Niazi. I don't think there are major groupings now. Some who were opposed to Taliban policies joined Daesh, ISIS. Others, have rejoined the mainstream Taliban and accepted the leadership of Sheikh Habatullah Khunzada. They had disputes with the previous Amir, Mullah Akhtar Mansour, but they have no differences with the present Supreme Commander. So I think that, Taliban can enforce a ceasefire. They control almost, 98% of the fighters, and they can enforce, any decision which is taken by Taliban. And I think the Americans have realized that. That's why they held talks with them. They had a peace agreement, and they also, said, okay, we will believe you that you will not allow the areas controlled by you to be used for attacks against the US and its allies.
Okay. Dr. Fontan, you heard Rahimullah Yusufzai. So the Taliban, there is a hierarchy. There were groupings, as Rahimullah Yusufzai was saying, but Taliban effectively control their fighters on the ground. And when they say it's going to be ceasefire, it is a ceasefire. So I think that issue perhaps needs to be put to rest. However, the point is that Kabul's own security is the responsibility of First Vice President Amrullah Saleh. You know it and I know it. He has been rabidly anti-Taliban from the get-go. And he still is opposed to a peace deal with the Taliban. So does that not make him one of the spoilers, especially because he is also responsible for the security of Kabul, and still attacks happen in areas of Kabul that are otherwise heavily guarded?
Well, I would say that Amrullah Saleh has suffered heavily on the hand of Taliban violence. He is realistic about the capabilities of the Taliban and realistic about the different scenarios that are about to unfold before our eyes in Afghanistan. I would say that you're absolutely right. The security of Kabul pertains to the Afghan government. They have utterly failed at maintaining that security because many of the different political leaders that we have seen in your report earlier are too busy fighting between one another to actually have a unified response to some of the violence that is taking place and a unified political response towards the Taliban. So that definitely, that is a fact. Actually, the car that was used for the Darebashi bombing had been in Kabul for more than a week. And so security services knew there was a car loaded with with explosives in Kabul for one whole week, and they had lost track of it, and then it exploded. So that is definitely a failure of the Afghan government to maintain security. And as you were talking about spoilers, it's quite interesting that every time there is a mass casualty attack such as this one, different groups blame one another. So the Taliban this time have said that the Afghan government is spoiling the peace process or the possibility of peace talks. In the past, it was the other way around. And somehow, again, this is a cynical game played by people who do not really care about the population on the ground that is suffering from those attacks. And let us remember that Kabul is not the only center of violence in Afghanistan at the moment. There is so much activity going on in different parts of the country, and casualties on both sides of that conflict. And again, different groups blaming one another. So the violence that we see in Kabul is just a tip of a much, much bigger iceberg that is claiming so many lives every day.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of violence. As far as the Taliban are concerned, they're very clear. As a matter of fact, they are very overt about the fact that they're not going to cease fire. And they're saying we're fighting the Afghan National Security Forces, and we'll continue to fight them until such time there is an agreement on a government, and a power-sharing formula. So I don't think they're hiding that at all. But what they have constantly rejected in the past some months are attacks on soft targets. So I think that is perhaps a distinction that we need to make. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Victoria Fontan speaking with us. Let me go back to Rahimullah Yusufzai on this. Rahimullah Yusufzai, another thing the Afghan government has said again, that the Taliban now have no reason, since the U.S. and U.S. allies' withdrawal has begun, and these were the foreign forces that the Taliban were fighting against. Therefore, now they do not. We actually discussed this previously also on this program with you, and we also had Hamdullah Hamdard on the panel that day, that they really don't have any reason to fight now. So they need to cease fire, and they need to sit down and work out a power-sharing agreement. Do you think that the Taliban will concede that? Because I do think that at some point, whatever gains that they've had on the ground, they need to actually begin to exploit them politically and on the negotiating table.
Yasab, I think that Taliban reasons for continuing to fight are becoming less stronger. But we have to keep in mind that the U.S. withdrawal is still taking place. It will end on September 11. Until that time, Taliban have justification to keep them under pressure, because you never know, the Americans may again back out of this commitment as they have done earlier. So Taliban, have their own reasons why they will continue to fight at least until September 11. And then the next stage would be that, if they announce a ceasefire, what would they get in return? That's very important, to keep their rank and file satisfied, to keep them on board. So they have to ensure at least two things. And these two things were committed by the U.S. in the Doha peace agreement with Taliban. One was that the U.S. will start diplomatic efforts to get the remaining Taliban prisoners released. Secondly, the U.S. will start diplomatic efforts 3 months after the start of the peace talks, intra-Afghan peace talks, to get the Taliban names removed from the UN Security Council blacklist. So those things have not happened. Taliban say that they have justification, that these things should be done as the Americans committed. The Americans have their own grievances. They say Taliban have not reduced violence, or Taliban are not holding meaningful peace talks. They both have reasons, but I think that even now, when you saw this big Taliban attack in Helmand on the capital Lashkargah, the American Air Force again became involved and bombed the Taliban positions. to keep them at bay. So it's not that the fighting is over, and it's not that only one side is fighting. All sides are trying their best to gain some more ground, to inflict some more casualties, to improve their bargaining position. Taliban are doing that, but the other sides also are doing that.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Rahimullah Yusufzai speaking with us. Joining me now is Sangar Paykhar, freelance journalist and commentator on Afghan current affairs. You also host Afghan Eye podcast. Mr. Paykhar, thank you so much for being on the program. Really appreciate it. We were discussing the fact that, of course, the efforts afoot trying to fast-pace a peace process. The Pakistan Army chief was there in Kabul yesterday. Last week, Pakistani delegation was in Qatar trying to nudge the Taliban into declaring a ceasefire, which they've done for Eid, but obviously it's just 3 days. And then, of course, the absolutely horrific attack in Dasht-e-Barchi, then a roadside bomb striking a passenger bus and all of that. So give us, for our viewers, give us a sense of the situation on the ground and some kind of prognosis of, now that the withdrawal has begun, a prognosis of where you think it might be headed.
From what I have gathered in the last couple of days is that the growing violence all across the country is a very concerning development, because for the last 2 years, most people in Afghanistan hope that when the withdrawal finalizes, that there will be a meaningful peace negotiation between the Taliban and Afghan government. Now things have turned to worse, because now we see fighting in pretty much all provinces, even in some districts in Kabul. There have been heavy fightings, and as you have mentioned, the terrorist attack in Dasht-e-Barchi is causing a lot of concern. I hear from a lot of people in Kabul, but in other parts of the country who are preparing to leave the country. A lot of people are trying to sell their properties. They are trying to find another place to live, like in the United Arab Emirates, or for those who are wealthy, and people less fortunate, they are trying to escape to Turkey or Pakistan or Iran. And in my opinion, if we talk about the Afghan peace process, right now it is pretty much stuck. There's no development, and for the Afghan government, it is very important to have some sort of assurance that they can stay and that the Taliban will not overrun all cities and districts. And for that reason, they're trying to reach out to all stakeholders, including the Pakistani army chief who was recently in Kabul. And they expect from the Pakistani authorities to put some pressure on the Taliban and make them to agree to some sort of peace settlement. But the problem is that in Kabul, the authorities, they don't really know how much power and influence the Pakistani army has over the Taliban. And they just assume that if they make demands from the Pakistanis, then that will result into a ceasefire. But what we have seen in the last 2 years is that the Taliban have their own agenda, and they have gained international legitimacy by the whole agreement with the United States and attending all these important gatherings, conferences in Moscow and other places. So the Taliban are reluctant. They don't see any reason why they should give up everything now, because they see themselves as victors. But that attitude is very concerning, because while they have successfully managed to make an agreement with the Americans so that they leave, they still have no clear indication of what they are going to do after the full withdrawal. So in my opinion, what is absolutely necessary at this moment is that both the Afghan government and the Taliban stop fighting, and that they should proceed talking with each other. But from what it looks like, both sides don't have any incentive to make any concessions. They both want to basically preserve as much power as they have and even increase their own power. So for most Afghan observers, this is actually a very concerning situation, because we are being we are becoming very disillusioned.
Absolutely. I think you couldn't have put it better. Thank you for a very incisive analysis. That was Sangar, Paykhar speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the situation in Myanmar. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Myanmar's junta has designated the rival National Unity Government a terrorist group, blaming it for killings, bombings, and arson. This was reported by Myanmar state media last Saturday. After Myanmar's February 1st coup, a group of ousted lawmakers, many of them previously part of Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, formed a shadow government. State-controlled television slammed the NUG as a terror group. The announcement comes a day after the NUG announced the creation of a so-called People's Defense Force to protect civilians from the military. The NUG has described the junta as a terrorist force. Thousands of protesters took to the streets on Saturday. Despite the junta's violent crackdown, at least 774 civilians have been killed by Myanmar security forces, while 3,778 are detained. And this is according to the Assistant Association for Political Prisoners activist group. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Bridget Welsh, Honorary Research Associate with the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute, Malaysia, and Nay San Lwin, a Rohingya activist and blogger. Let me begin with Dr. Welsh here. Dr. Welsh, the sheer gall of it, frankly, I mean, I had a silent chuckle when I read this, that the junta calling the National Unity Government a terrorist group. But give me your sense of the situation and where it is headed.
What we have seen is a situation where it has become much more polarized. There is no middle ground there between the different actors, and they're labeling each other in very harsh ways. And of course, the military is trying to discredit the National Unity Government through these type of tactics. And of course, what it does, ironically, is strengthen it. But we've seen a very important changes on the ground. We now see more attacks on military facilities. We see a situation where the NUG government is working with ethnic armed groups. And I think the situation has gotten more severe for the military. And that's why we're seeing this type of label.
Right. We have had a few programs. I remember the first program that I did on the Myanmar situation. You were on the panel and you talked about the reasons why the coup had happened, why the military wants to retain its primacy within the power configuration in Myanmar. But some of the issues that were ultimately discussed had to do with the fact that the ethnic groups, armed groups, had actually given an ultimatum to the junta saying, if you do not take the situation back to status quo ante, and if you do not stop the crackdown, then we will support the protesters. So is that the kind of situation that is unfolding now?
In some ways, yes, in the sense that the armed groups have made their choices. Not all the armed groups, importantly. So some are on the sidelines, which, for example, in the Rakhine area, and also some of the Shan communities as well. But I think what we've seen also is a situation where the military has launched, bombings and shelling of areas such in the Karen state. And so the fighting with ethnic armed groups has also escalated. The military is actually fighting on multiple fronts. It's trying to secure control over the country, both within the bureaucracy itself, but also over the different protests against it, which are taking on continue to take on many different brave fronts.
Apparently, some section within the military and the police force, ethnic groups, have also deserted. Is that correct?
That is true. Many of them deserted through India. I've seen reports of that. But I think also the military has tried to keep its troops together, and in part they're trying to show a force in order to do that because people in the military are conscious that there will be very big consequences for them leaving, and it's not just for them themselves but also for their families because this is a regime that is very brutal.
Okay, let's Nathan Lwin. Mr. Lwin, you want to add something to what Dr. Welsh is saying, or comment on what she has said about, because basically this seems like the situation is headed towards a civil war.
I have not much to add, but what they have made, the announcement, against the NUG government is a joke to me, because since the mid-February, the military has been committing the crime against humanity, against the entire population. They are the, people. They have the full responsibility to protect the people. Instead, they are, they're terrorizing the people every day and night. So the people inside the country, no one feels safe. Everyone is unprotected. So they are actually, declared by the CRPH as a terrorist organization. As an activist, I would ask, or the world to declare them as a terrorist organization, because they have been terrorizing all the ethnic minority, including the Rohingya, for many decades. Now you have got a lot of footage. If you go to the Twitter and the Facebook, you will see how they are terrorizing everything, the people. While we are talking here.
Sorry. I just need clarification. You talking about elements of the national unity government terrorizing the people, or are you talking about the junta?
The military junta, the Tamador is terrorizing the people, not the NUG. NUG, they just established the People Defense Force. They are, yes, of course, somehow preparing to fight back with the military, but they don't have they don't have anything yet. So there are the younger people in the ethnic area. They are getting trained, but they will be back. I think in a few weeks, and they will fight back with the military. But still, the whatever claiming by the military are all the misinformation, disinformation, and the fake news.
Okay, so basically we have in Myanmar two levels. At one level, you've got the ordinary people, professionals, traders, students, activists, taking to the streets and protesting peacefully. And then another level that's been evolving, where some of the protesters are now linking up with the armed ethnic groups and are actually putting up armed resistance against the security forces. Have I got this right?
Yeah, sure, yes.
Okay, let's go back to Dr. Welsh. Dr. Welsh, give me your reading of the sort of agreement that ASEAN tried to reach with the junta, and which was incidentally rejected by the protesters in Myanmar, saying that it basically does nothing to get the situation back to status quo ante or reversal of coup and release of political prisoners and the rest of it. So that ASEAN effort did not come to much, frankly, and one could also possibly argue that not unwittingly perhaps, but it almost gave some kind of legitimacy to the coup-making general. Is that something that you would agree with? I mean, how do you look at that ASEAN effort, and Do you think ASEAN could do anything more than what they've already tried to do?
One has to give ASEAN some credit for trying to create a dialogue. It failed, I think, in terms of what we see is the NUG government has rejected wanting to be part of that process, and the military who came basically has walked back almost every of the steps that it promised, including an envoy. And in a sense, they played ASEAN quite calculatingly, and they've done that before in the international community, and I think it shouldn't come as a surprise. And I do believe you're correct in describing it, the fact that they gained something from that. I would probably not go as far as to say they were legitimized, because I think there are many people in ASEAN, including ASEAN leaders, who tried to move away from recognition. But it did give them some sense of clout and recognition that to such an extent that it allowed them to kind of have space to move back from the measures that they made for ASEAN. There is projected to be another ASEAN meeting next month in June. I think that ASEAN would like to continue the discussions, but it's very problematic to do so for two reasons. Number one is it's excluding the legitimate government that most people in Myanmar support, which is the NUG government. It's not a terrorist organization by any means. What it's doing on the ground is not just organizing issues associated with armed forces, it's also providing support for people as much as it can, because the country is going through an economic crisis and a social crisis as well. The second aspect, I think, is that you have a situation where the ASEAN risks more being played by the military, the more that they give the opportunities for them to engage with the military. Caught in between a very difficult position. I do think there is something worthy of having a conversation, but I'm not so convinced that I think it's hurting ASEAN to be leading this, because we still see the killings going on. We still see the arrests, and these are very deeply troubling. They're affecting too many people, and it's a very brutal regime that is carrying these things out.
Okay. Final question, Dr. Welsh, before I wrap up. It seems to me, from where I stand, that both sides now have reached a point where, I mean, the junta in doubling down on the original sin, the protesters not, backing down. Both sides have reached a position which is maximalist, and the space for any kind of negotiations have shrunk. For the junta, staying on now become an existential issue or a problem, if you will. To that extent, it seems that short of more violence, which is an unfortunate statement to make, but given the situation on the ground, it's unlikely for the situation to get better. It's like Eliot saying, "And that to be restored, our sickness must grow worse."
I think it's very clear that Myanmar is facing a very difficult circumstances, and most important, the Myanmar people are the ones that are suffering considerably with this situation, where the military continues to try to hold on at the expense of the country's future. But I do think that the situation is evolving, and I think, yes, you're correct that it's going to be a very difficult period. But in particular, it's important to look at what happens in the economy, because the economy will put tremendous pressure on the military. The military is already trying to control parts of the administrative apparatus with considerable resistance, not just that on the streets, but also inside the system. So I think what we will see is what is happening in terms of the economy as being a catalyst for that. The concerns, however, are the humanitarian implications for the Myanmar people and what that means, because they're the ones that are on the real front lines here as they're having to face these circumstances. And in particular, another element of that is whether or not COVID-19 will also expand in Myanmar. And this, of course, raises some other concerns.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. That was Dr. Bridget Walsh. Thank you also to Nay San Lwin for his insights into the situation. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. And given the third COVID-19 wave in Pakistan and also in other parts of the world, stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols. Good night and goodbye.